This DNA could rewrite human history. 10,000-year-old secret revealed there is a genetic signature that should not exist, yet it appears in human remains dated over 10,000 years old. A sequence that does not fully match any known ancient population, any migration pattern, or any accepted version of early human history. It is not entirely foreign, but it doesn't belong either. And the more scientists look at it, the more one uncomfortable possibility begins to emerge. Our understanding of where we come from may be incomplete. For decades, human history has followed a relatively stable narrative. Early humans migrated out of Africa, slowly spreading across continents, adapting to different environments, forming distinct cultures. Archaeology supported this story. Genetics seemed to confirm it. Everything, at least on the surface, made sense. But then something unusual was uncovered, buried deep beneath layers of earth, in a site long thought to be ordinary. The remains were not particularly remarkable at first glance. Bone fragments, tools, signs of early settlement. The kind of discovery that typically adds small details to an already known timeline. But when researchers extracted DNA from those bones, they noticed something that didn't fit. Certain genetic markers were present that should not have been there, not in that time period, not in that region, and not in that combination. At first, it was dismissed as contamination. That's often the simplest explanation. Ancient DNA is fragile, easily affected by modern interference. But repeated tests showed the same result. Different labs, different methods, the anomaly remained. It wasn't contamination. It was real. And that's where the problem began. Because if the data was correct, then the individuals these remains belonged to were not exactly like the populations we believe lived at that time. They carried genetic traits that appear far more developed, more complex, almost ahead of their era. Not advanced in a technological sense, but biologically unexpected. As if they were connected to a lineage we have not yet identified. The official explanation tried to contain the anomaly. Some researchers suggested it could be a previously unknown branch of early humans, one that split off and evolved separately before disappearing. Others proposed that it might be evidence of interbreeding between known species, similar to how modern humans carry traces of Neanderthal DNA. That explanation feels comfortable, familiar. It keeps the timeline intact. But there's a problem with it. Because the genetic markers found in these remains do not fully match Neanderthals. Nor do they align with Denisovans or any other known archaic human group. In fact, parts of the sequence appear unique. Not entirely new, but not fully explained either. It's like finding a sentence written in a language you almost understand, but not quite. And that raises a deeper question. If this DNA doesn't come from any known human lineage, then where did it come from? As researchers looked closer, they noticed something even more unsettling. The same unusual markers, or fragments of them, appear in small percentages within certain modern populations today. Scattered, faint, but present. Which suggests that whatever this ancient group was, they didn't completely vanish. They became part of us. This is where the mystery begins to deepen. One theory suggests that this represents a lost migration, an early group of humans who left Africa much earlier than we thought, evolving in isolation, before eventually mixing back into the larger population. It's a clean explanation. It fits within the boundaries of what we already believe. But it doesn't explain the timing. Because the genetic complexity found in these remains seems too developed for that early period. Evolution doesn't usually move in sudden leaps like this. It moves gradually, predictably. Yet here, something appears accelerated. Another theory proposes that we are missing an entire chapter of Human history, one that has been erased, either by time or by catastrophe. A civilization, or at least a population, that developed in ways we don't fully understand, leaving behind only faint genetic traces. If that's true, then the archaeological record we rely on is incomplete, not just missing details, but missing entire stories. And then there's a third, more controversial idea. That this DNA does not represent a separate branch of humans at all, but rather, an external influence. Not in the sense of science fiction, but in the possibility that human evolution was not as isolated as we assume. That interactions, migrations, or unknown environmental factors introduced genetic variations that we still cannot fully trace. Most scientists are cautious about this theory. It stretches beyond conventional boundaries. But they don't dismiss the data, because the data is still there. Then came a breakthrough. A recent study, conducted using more advanced sequencing technology, reanalyzed these ancient samples with greater precision. Instead of looking at isolated markers, researchers examined the full genetic structure, mapping patterns across thousands of data points. What they found didn't simplify the mystery, it made it more complex. The unusual DNA wasn't random. It followed patterns. Structured patterns. Suggesting it wasn't the result of a mutation or accident, but part of a stable lineage, one that existed long enough to leave a consistent genetic imprint. And that changes everything. Because it means this wasn't a one-time anomaly. It was a population. A group of humans, or something very close to human, that lived, reproduced, and eventually merged into the broader human story, without leaving clear evidence of their existence. But here's the twist. When researchers compared this ancient DNA to modern genomes, they noticed something unexpected. The fragments that still exist today are not evenly distributed. They appear more frequently in populations located far from the original discovery site. In regions that, according to current models, should have had little to no contact with that ancient group. In other words, the genetic trail doesn't follow the map. It suggests movement, migration routes that we haven't accounted for. Connections between distant populations that shouldn't exist, at least not at that time. It's as if there was a hidden network of human interaction, operating beneath the surface of recorded history. And the deeper scientists look, the clearer one thing becomes. We don't fully understand how humans spread across the planet. But the deeper twist goes even further. Because this isn't just about where people traveled. It's about how they changed. The presence of this DNA appears to influence certain traits, subtle but measurable. Immune responses, adaptation to extreme environments, even neurological patterns. Nothing dramatic on its own, but together, they suggest that this ancient genetic contribution may have helped shape the way modern humans survive and think. Which means, this unknown population didn't just exist. It mattered. Their biology, whatever it was, became part of the foundation of who we are today. Quietly. Invisibly. Without recognition. Imagine that for a moment. A group of people living 10,000 years ago, whose existence we are only beginning to notice, may have influenced the way your body responds to the world. The way your cells function. The way your brain processes information. Not directly, not obviously, but subtly, in ways we are only now starting to detect. I remember the first time I read about this kind of discovery. It didn't feel like history. It felt personal. Because it suggests that the past isn't something distant and disconnected. It's inside us. Written into our DNA, waiting to be decoded. And that leads to the final question. Why does this matter? Because history is not just about what happened. It's about what we believe happened. And if that belief is incomplete, then our understanding of ourselves is incomplete too. This discovery doesn't give us clear answers. It does something more important. It shows us that there are still parts of our origin story that remain hidden, not lost forever, but waiting, quietly, in fragments of bone and strands of DNA, for us to notice. And maybe the most unsettling part is this. If one hidden lineage can exist without us knowing, how many more are still out there? The question stayed there, lingering longer than expected. If one hidden lineage could exist without us knowing, then how many more are still out there, quietly woven into the story we think we understand? For a long time, that question didn't have a clear answer, not because scientists weren't searching, but because they didn't yet know how to recognize what they were seeing. The fragments we found before were already difficult to explain. But what came next made those earlier discoveries feel almost simple. This time, the focus shifted away from physical excavation and toward something far more complex. Data itself, patterns hidden inside millions of genetic sequences that, on their own, seemed insignificant but together began to reveal something unsettling. Across the world, different research teams were analyzing DNA from various populations, each study designed for its own purpose: ancestry mapping, disease research, evolutionary tracking. At first glance, these studies had nothing to do with each other. They were separated by geography, by methodology, even by intention. But when a small group of researchers began comparing these datasets side by side, something unusual began to emerge. It wasn't obvious. In fact, it was so subtle that it could easily have been ignored. But once noticed, it became impossible to dismiss. The same strange genetic fragments, not identical but clearly related, started appearing again and again, scattered across different populations like echoes of a signal no one had fully understood yet. This changed everything, because now the mystery was no longer confined to a single ancient site or one isolated group of remains. It was something much larger, something that stretched across continents and timelines. Whatever that unknown lineage was, it hadn't just existed in one place and disappeared. It had left traces in multiple regions, in ways that didn't follow any known pattern of human migration. And that's where the confusion deepened, because when scientists mapped these genetic markers geographically, the results didn't form a clear path. Instead of a smooth progression from one region to another, the data showed clusters, pockets of similarity separated by vast distances, with no obvious connection between them. In normal circumstances, human movement leaves behind a trail that can be followed. Genetic markers shift gradually, blending over time as populations interact and evolve. But this pattern didn't behave that way. It appeared suddenly in one place, then vanished, only to appear again somewhere completely different. It was as if the usual rules of migration didn't apply here, as if something else was shaping the distribution. Some researchers proposed that early humans may have been far more mobile than we currently believe, capable of traveling extreme distances in relatively short periods of time. While that idea is not impossible, it still fails to explain the abrupt appearance of these markers, because even rapid movement tends to leave intermediate traces, and those traces are missing here. Another explanation suggested something even more complex, that this unknown lineage didn't spread outward in a single direction but instead existed alongside multiple human populations simultaneously, interacting with them independently. If that were true, it would mean that this group was not isolated or hidden in one remote location, but rather present across different regions, crossing paths with early humans again and again without leaving behind a clear identity of its own. This idea is difficult to accept, not because it's impossible, but because it challenges the simplicity of the timeline we've built, a timeline where each group has a place, a path, and a defined role in the story of human evolution. Then came a development that pushed the mystery even further. Instead of ancient bones, the next clues came from modern DNA databases. As genetic testing became more common, millions of people voluntarily submitted their DNA, hoping to learn about their ancestry or family origins. These databases became one of the largest collections of human genetic information ever assembled. Hidden within that enormous dataset, researchers found something they weren't specifically looking for. The same unusual markers, appearing again, this time not in ancient remains, but in living individuals. The amounts were small, almost negligible at first glance, but consistent enough to confirm something critical. Whatever this genetic signature was, it had not disappeared. It had survived. What made this discovery even more intriguing was the way these markers were distributed among modern populations. They did not align neatly with known ancestry groups. People from completely different backgrounds, with no shared recent history, were found to carry similar fragments. This suggests that the introduction of this DNA into the human population happened so far back in time that it spread quietly, gradually, across generations, becoming diluted but never completely erased. It also suggests that the original source of this DNA interacted with multiple groups, not just one, leaving behind a legacy that is now nearly invisible but still present. At this point, the question begins to shift once again. It is no longer just about identifying an unknown group from the past. It becomes something more personal, more immediate. If this DNA is still within us, even in small amounts, then it is not just part of history. It is part of who we are. It influences us in ways we may not yet fully understand, affecting biological processes so subtle that they go unnoticed in everyday life. Some studies have hinted that these ancient genetic fragments may be linked to how the body responds to certain environments, how the immune system reacts to unfamiliar threats, even how the brain processes information under specific conditions. None of these effects are dramatic on their own, but together they suggest that this unknown lineage contributed something meaningful to the development of modern humans. And that realization changes the perspective entirely. Because now, this is not just a mystery about the past. It is a mystery about the present, about the hidden layers within our own biology that connect us to something we cannot fully explain. Imagine carrying a piece of history inside you, something that does not belong to any known group, something that traces back to a population we have yet to identify. It is both fascinating and unsettling at the same time, because it reminds us that we are not as fully understood as we might like to believe. The deeper scientists go into this data, the more complex the picture becomes. Each answer leads to new questions, each discovery reveals new uncertainties. And perhaps that is the most important part of this entire story. Not the idea that history might be incomplete, but the realization that it is still being written. Not in books or monuments, but in the very code that defines us, a code that continues to reveal secrets long after the people who carried them are gone. And if these hidden fragments have managed to survive for thousands of years without being fully recognized, then it raises one final, quiet possibility. This may not be the only story we have yet to uncover.